Joining me now is Maggie Haberman. She's a White House correspondent for the New York Times and co-author of the incredible new book, Regime Change. There are so many things to learn from this book. I know you've been talking about it. Hundreds of thousands of people have bought this book or more. Congratulations on that.
Thank
but
you,
it tells
Jen.
us, I think, a lot of course, thanks for being here. It tells us a lot about how Trump thinks about things. I was so interested also in how you've talked about how he's changed or how the White House has changed from the first to the second term. I just read an excerpt from your book. It's one that has really stuck with me about the scene very early on in the war with Iran, when Trump seemed more focused on picking out maple trees for the White House than he was on the war. I mean, you describe it as when you all went in to talk to him. I just wonder, as we're kind of all watching what he's focused on, as there is a lot happening in this country, how do you reflect on that moment? What do you think it means, or what should it tell people?
It really was extraordinary, Jen, and it actually didn't strike us. I think I shouldn't speak for Jonathan. I know for me, it did not strike me as quite as remarkable as it clearly was later on in reflection while we were sitting there. It was a stunning moment. We both had many with him. And I did note that he posted about maple trees last night, having had that be the focus of his attention when we first got there. But as you noted, we wrote that the war was just not at all. We were 17 days in. We thought we would see maps on, of the Middle East on the Resolute desk. And instead there were these tree pictures. Underneath that were pictures of his ballroom designs. And he was very proud of the columns, and they would be bigger than the ones at the Supreme Court. And some were in honor of Rome, some in honor of Athens. And about 15 minutes into this conversation, we asked him a question about presidential power, because he had been telling people that he was the most powerful president that had ever been in the U.S. And we asked him if that was his view. And he responded by having his ever-present aide, Natalie Harp, who sits along the wall of the Oval Office in almost every meeting, get us this printout that he said was by a historian. And it was a friend of Gary Players, the golfer. And the basic premise of this printout was that Donald Trump is the most powerful man who's ever walked the planet. And then it goes on to list history's, most notable one-name conquerors and monsters: Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, Hitler, Mao, Stalin, Tamerlane, the Caesars. And Trump is reading from this list, as he calls them the top 10. And there's no moral component. He was just reveling in being in the company of these powerful people. And what he wanted us to understand was that the takeaway here was that they had power, but he had more, and he was willing to use it. And that was clearly something that he thought Iran was going to understand. That the historian was not a historian. It was Gary Player's former caddy. But what was remarkable to us is, other than him reading this list, it basically was the premise of our book, the most powerful person to walk the planet aside. The idea was about how focused he is on power and expanding power. But he has now gotten himself into a situation in Iran where he believed this was going to be quick, based on his power, based on his gut feeling that things will always work out. He thought they were a paper tiger, based on how last year's 12-day war went. And it's not going that way.
No, it's not. And a lot of people I know from your reporting and from others have told him that along the way, that it wouldn't go that way. Let's talk about this jet, because you also write about the jet. You've talked about the jet. It's now, of course, back in the news because he rode the jet there and then didn't ride it back. There's a whole backstory of this. I think the question I'm curious about is, it seems clear to anybody that anybody who's giving him a gift like this would want something in return. I assume he's thought about that and maybe doesn't care about it. But what should we understand about that particular piece of it? And also the notion that it wasn't going to be able to fly back. Do you think that was understood? It didn't have the capacity? Or what do you think is going on there?
So there's a couple of things in terms of what the expectation is on this gift. What we say in the book is that, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure this piece out. This plane was a used plane. The Qataris had been trying to sell it for a while. It was initially, according to our reporting, supposed to be sold to the U.S. government for maybe $150 million, $200 million, because it's an old plane, because it's a used plane, not as old as Air Force One, but it is not a new model. And what we were told by a senior administration official was that it was suddenly becoming a gift, and this was something discussed, quote, at the POTUS level. And so that suggested to us these were conversations between the president and his advisors, and it suddenly became something that was being given to him, not just for the U.S. government, but that he plans to take with him, as you know, when he leaves. And most people who we talk to have a hard time believing he is going to just let it sit in a museum. His library is not an actual, it's a skyscraper. It's likely to be a hotel. So putting all of that aside, what the expectation is, it's hard to know because there are so many overlapping business ties between the Trump relatives, between Trump's top advisors, and the Qataris and others in the Mideast, that it's very hard to tell where one begins and one ends. And so, whether there's a specific thing or a long-term relationship piece, it's hard to say. The second piece, though, that you're asking about, which is the security piece, it was always told to Jonathan and me that this was going to be on a rushed schedule to get this plane out, that they were going to work to get it up to security code. We don't know what we don't know. But based on everything we have heard and based on your colleagues reporting, based on our colleagues reporting that the Secret Service was concerned, if you are bringing in the older Air Force One, which was known to be well fitted with security equipment for that traveling Oval Office, as you describe it, to survive all kinds of safety problems, there was clearly a reason why that plane was used with the shades down as they were flying out, which is also known as a security measure. And ultimately, they met up with the other plane. I think that there is a lot more we are going to learn, but we know that hundreds of millions of dollars were spent already to upgrade this plane, the current one now, the Qatari plane, to make it appropriate for the president. And we still don't know exactly what that looks like or what's missing.
You and Jonathan know so well about the inner functionings of this White House and the people around Trump. One of the things I've been curious about is we know from your reporting and others reporting that everyone isn't exactly thrilled in the White House about Trump's focus on so much time and energy on these vanity projects and on all of these construction projects, given everything that's happening in the world. To me, having worked for two presidents for like 7 or chiefs of staff or something, I'm so curious about the role of Susie Wiles, because every chief of staff I've worked for would go into the Oval Office and say, what the hell are we doing? Like, this needs to stop. And that may not work with Trump, and I'm guessing that's what you're going to tell me. But tell us more about her role, and where does she kind of put a stop to things, or does she not? Is that not really her role at all?
So a couple of things. One, to your thing about your point about the vanity projects, he is so determined to leave some kind of an indelible imprint on Washington where it can't be removed when he leaves, that people will always have to sort of look at the ballroom he built or the arch he built or on and on. In terms of the chief of staff, we describe in the book how much more so than in term one, you have meetings that are just these rolling bull sessions where we describe this pretty incredible high-level national security defense briefing in the Oval Office, where the guy who's putting in the stone pavers, I guess it was, or, stones that were going over the rose garden grass, just walks in. And it's like he has Oval Office walk-in privileges. He's just showing the president this in the middle of this significant briefing. And much of the day is like that around the president now. They're very good at keeping secrets when they want to, which is something else that we talk about. And that is partly a function of Susie Wiles. But what we describe in the book is a chief of staff who does not try to manage the president's time, possibly thinking that it's a wasted venture, to your question. She has been more successful at managing that team than any Trump chief of staff has been at managing the world around him. But the reality is he wants to do what he wants to do. And so, yes, I am going to tell you what you knew I was going to say, which is that it only works so far. And in the same way that everybody has to make decisions about whether they're going to argue with him when they work for him, that he's telling these, fantastical stories about events that just didn't happen. They came to me with tears in their eyes or this or that. They make a decision. If they're going to stay, they're not going to challenge everything. But he has very, very low tolerance for being challenged, far more so now than before.
That seems very clear. Maggie Haberman, your book is so good. It's so good because, for a range of reasons, it helps people really understand the scope of it. It's not just about 1 week for people who haven't read it yet. It's really about the first term, the second term, and kind of how he's different now, which I think is important for people to know, even if they don't like the guy, frankly. But thank you again for being here tonight. Appreciate it.
I really appreciate you having me, Jen. Thanks.
And on the 132nd day of his war, Donald Trump returned from the NATO summit in Turkey, proclaiming himself a peacemaker to reporters gathered on the plane.
Think of the wars I settled, 8. The wars that were going on for 30. Even if you look in the Congo versus Rwanda, they settled it. After 14 years and about 15 million people had their heads chopped. I settled that one. I settled 8 wars. And when she won the Nobel Prize for Peace, she said, I can't believe I won it. The only one that should win it is Trump. Actually, they probably will do the wrong thing. It's very sad with Norway, but I would say I should have won that award more than anybody that ever received the Nobel Peace Prize. Because nobody settled wars. I settled 8 of them because of a certain type of personality I was able to settle.
He does have a certain type of personality. He's right about that. It is the subject of the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president, published in 2017, which in its latest edition is now titled The Much More Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 50 psychiatrists and mental health experts warn anew. The mental health experts who have not personally examined Donald Trump up close, but whose opinions appear in those books, generally agree on a diagnosis of extreme narcissism with an assortment of other pathologies, some of which explain his general inability to tell the truth about anything, including wars that he claims to have settled. We have featured some of the psychiatrists who have contributed to those books on this program, including Dr. Lance Dotis, a former professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and none of them indicated that Donald Trump's personality could, in any way, help him settle wars. Negotiating a peace agreement with another country would, of course, require, at a minimum, a knowledge of the history of that country, and Donald Trump has repeatedly demonstrated he does not know the history of any country, including his own. It would also, of course, require something Donald Trump does not have: patience, along with dedication, along with attention. He has none of those things, as anyone can tell without being a psychiatrist. While Donald Trump was proclaiming himself to be a great peacemaker to the reporters on his plane, the war he started was still raging in Iran, being no closer to settlement than it was on the first day of Donald Trump's war. The New York Times reports, quote, the U.S. military said overnight that it had struck more than 170 targets in Iran during the previous 48 hours, a significant uptick. And Jordan, which hosts some U.S. military forces but had not been a focus of Tehran's ire in recent flare-ups, said it had intercepted Iranian missiles in its airspace. Iran also said it had fired at U.S. targets in the Gulf nations of Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Iran threatened on Thursday to expand its attacks to other American military facilities in the region. When asked on the airplane last night, are we returning to full-scale military conflict, Donald Trump said, I don't know. In fact, he said it twice. I don't know. I don't know. You would think that the person who in that same discussion proclaimed himself to be the world's greatest peacemaker, the greatest peacemaker of all time, the greatest peacemaker in the human history, would have some idea of how close to peace he was in his war on its 132nd day. And after saying, I don't know, when asked about the state of his war, Donald Trump, the peacemaker, said this.
We have many ways we can win, but we've already won militarily. They have very little left, and they want to make a deal so badly. They called a little while ago, they want to make a deal so badly.
Donald Trump has said they want to make a deal so badly, those exact words, almost every day of his now 132 days of war. He has been lying every single time he has said that. And at the same time, Iran has demonstrated two things with absolute consistency every day of Donald Trump's war against Iran. One, Iran will not surrender. And two, Iran does not want to make a deal so badly. Iran has shown no eagerness to make a deal at any time, none. And Donald Trump has shown himself to be desperate to make a deal, which is why he agreed to a memo of understanding with Iran, which was full of concessions, immediate concessions to Iran, with no concessions to the United States by Iran. That memo of understanding called for a 60-day ceasefire, a ceasefire that has been violated repeatedly. It seems clear that the one true thing Donald Trump said about his war in Iran today was, I don't know. The question was, remember, are we returning to full-scale military conflict, sir? And he said, I don't know. I don't know. Now, it's one thing for us not to know if the war is returning to full-scale military conflict. It's one thing for no one in Congress to know if the war is returning to full-scale military conflict. But it is a very different thing for the guy who started the war to not know if we are returning to full-scale military conflict, because it is his decision to return or not return to full-scale military conflict. And what he is admitting right there is he just does not know, meaning he does not know what to do. It's his war. He's commander-in-chief, and he has no idea what to do. None. That's what he admitted to. At age 80, in the middle of the night, on an airplane, he no longer has the strength to fake it as fully as such situations require of someone like Donald Trump. And so when asked what he's going to do next in his war, in effect, he said, I don't know. No commander-in-chief of the American military has ever given that answer about the state of a conflict. You can search the transcripts of President Lyndon Johnson and President Nixon's public discussions of the war in Vietnam and the various stages of battle, and you will never once find one of those presidents saying, I don't know. It turns out there was much the presidents of the United States didn't know about what was going to happen in the Vietnam War, but they were all careful enough in their public commentary to never be forced to publicly admit to the American people, I don't know. That is Donald Trump's unique contribution to commanders-in-chief public dialogue during warfare. Before he left the NATO summit, Donald Trump had what appeared to be a senior moment. You know, the kind of thing that can happen to any of us when we hallucinate that we're sitting beside Vladimir Putin.
Do you have a question for President Putin, George?
There he is, inviting the audience of reporters to ask a question of the man sitting beside him, the man he gestures to, President Putin. And here is the man who was sitting beside him, who Donald Trump called President Putin. And so once again, we have to imagine what the American news media, what the Republican Party would have been doing for the last day or more if Joe Biden had ever pointed to President Zelensky and called him President Putin. Once Donald Trump realized his mistake about that, he tried to cover for it by again asking the audience of reporters for a question that he should ask President Putin in a planned conversation with Putin later in the day. This is the first time in history that a president of the United States sought public advice from reporters about what to say to a president of Russia or a president of any country in the world in a presumably important phone call. And here is what happened.
Give us a question for Putin.
Why is he not attacking Ukraine
Because I'm
cities
speaking
if he
to him
wants
today.
peace?
Yeah, but Putin,
Why is he attacking
a good, hard
Ukraine
question.
cities if he wants peace?
when will he end this war?
That's a
the
good question. I don't think I've ever asked him that question. I've been asking
Please
that
do.
question.
And so there's Donald Trump's crime against humanity. Donald Trump's crime against the humanity that he should have been showing to the people of Ukraine every day of Vladimir Putin's war against the people of Ukraine, in which Vladimir Putin has attacked hospitals that have been forced to take pregnant women from their beds in the middle of giving birth and get them out of that hospital. Vladimir Putin, who has killed children in their homes, in what is now the fourth year of Vladimir Putin's war against the innocent and peace-loving people of Ukraine. Donald Trump said he has never even dared to ask Vladimir Putin the first question he should have asked him as president of the United States: when are you going to end this war? And he should have said it as a demand. Donald Trump lied to every person in America who made the mistake of voting for him last time by promising each and every one of those voters that he would end Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine on the first day of his presidency. He was lying every single time he said that. And on this, the 536th day of Donald Trump's presidency, Donald Trump still has never asked Vladimir Putin, when are you going to end this war? Donald Trump has still never demanded that Vladimir Putin end that war today. And we know that because the weary brain of Donald Trump just blurted out that confession of his incompetence, of his inhumane indifference to the suffering in Ukraine, and to his abject and repeated cowardice in the face of Vladimir Putin. I'm going to ask him that question, said Donald Trump, and we can be sure that he was lying when he said that. We can be sure that the coward who has never dared to ask Vladimir Putin that question did not ask Vladimir Putin that question in whatever conversation they may have had. And historians 100 years from now and hundreds of years from now can use that line right there to prove just how much Donald Trump did not do to settle wars, just how much Donald Trump did not care about Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, and just how much Donald Trump did not care about trying to save anyone's life in Ukraine.
No one knows what will actually happen in the future midterms because it depends on you and the voters and what people do. But we are getting indicators that are pretty striking. Texas, which is a ruby red, very pro-Trump state, is closer than it's ever been in the modern era for Democrats to take back, which means even if they don't ultimately win this Texas race, there's a lot of indicators there about how rough the Republicans are doing. The Democratic push to flip the Senate basically boils down to these 6 states. You see Texas at the bottom. In Maine, Dems are looking for a new candidate to replace the scandal-plagued Graham Plattner, but some Democrats say this actually is a blessing to get it figured out in advance of the deadlines, and they can put someone stronger in. So there's been a lot of attention, as you've probably noticed, on that state this week. But we're turning to Texas, where Democrat James Tallarico is going up against what many in the party, in the GOP, see as a big Trump mistake, ousting a relatively established incumbent senator who's won Senate races there before and putting in this Trumpy Republican Attorney General candidate, Ken Paxton. That has tightened what was already a tightening race. Look at this. Today, according to the reputable New York Times poll, they are tied within the margin of error, which means, if you believe that poll, it's anyone's race. A lot closer than we usually see between the parties there. Both campaigns also had to put out their fundraising numbers, and look at that. The excitement for the Democrat dwarfing Paxton's struggle, having been in a kind of costly and divided Republican civil war. He's got Trump's backing, but he doesn't have Trump's money yet. Paxton comes into this race with many scandals, and those have become attack ads from Republicans even during that Civil War primary I mentioned.
Crooked Ken Paxton cheated on his wife. She's divorcing him on biblical grounds. So now Paxton's wrecking another home, sleeping around with a married mother of 7.
Why does Ken Paxton go easy on child predators? A Waco attorney, Adam Hoffman, sexually abused a child for 3 years, and Paxton gutted the case, offering him just a slap on the wrist.
Those are the ads that Texas Republicans and other voters have already been hearing about. And if they have a long memory, Paxton was previously impeached by Republicans for alleged corruption. We should note he was acquitted by the Texas Senate. But for all the narratives we hear about everything being super partisan, this is a reminder that at least at the state level, there were some Republicans trying to hold this other Republican accountable for alleged corruption. He was also criminally indicted for fraud, charges that were later dismissed. Again, he is legally presumed innocent and was not convicted in those cases. But the question of whether you think he should get a promotion to write new laws and be a powerful person is a very different standard than him escaping criminal conviction. Paxton has a new controversy this week. He may have broken an election law that he had promised to enforce using this address where apparently, allegedly, he did not live while repeatedly voting. For his part, Paxton says he did follow the relevant law. Tallarico has been hammering Paxton on this. The strategy has focused on the other side of questioning the Democrats' masculinity, a kind of attack, the Wall Street Journal notes, that we've heard before. Whether it works in a down economy with this kind of alternative is an open question. Now, Democrats have long talked about flipping Texas and never done it. But the story we're telling you tonight is not just about whether or not they get over the line. It is a story about Donald Trump dragging down the Republican Party, interfering in a way that put in a less viable candidate, that's the Trump effect, and if you are spending money and energy to defend a red seat you're supposed to win in Texas, how much worse is it for Republicans on defense in the rest of the country?
They claim the AG used secret email accounts, burner phones, and a fake Uber account to see his mistress.
Paxton is a repugnant character. He's always been on the edge of sort of criminal activity.
3 felony fraud charges which have lingered for 9 long years.
And in between it all, the state's top attorney had a mugshot.
There are calls for Ken Paxton to step down.
James Tallarico is a hypocrite when it comes to fighting for families. Tallarico wants to teach trans ideology in schools and let boys compete in girls' sports. Tallarico says it's immoral to use the oil and gas that employs millions of Texans.
That's what Texas voters are already seeing in the clash between these two folks who want to be the senator from Texas. A much closer race than usual. Democrats feeling optimistic. As promised, we're bringing in Jeremy Wallace, political reporter for the Houston Chronicle, who's been closely watching all of this, and Obama campaign vet Che Komanduri. Jeremy, is it closer than usual? And what are you seeing on the ground that we might not notice nationally?
Yeah, it's closer than usual on a couple of fronts here. Look, we've had some close polling before with Beto O'Rourke when he ran in 2018, and even Colin Allred in 2024. There were close poll numbers. But when you dig into the poll numbers, both in that New York Times poll and the University of Texas poll that has also come out recently, you see how the reason this is so competitive is Ken Paxton is just losing independents like crazy. I've never seen numbers this low with independents. He's at 12% with independents. Understand that even Ted Cruz in his worst moments was never under 20%. Ken Paxton has a two-front war he has to deal with. One, he's trying to figure out how do you bring back those Republicans who did not vote for him and voted for John Cornyn and have always had a problem with him, right? You heard it in those clips before. He has a lot of Republican repair work to do. So he has one front there, and then he has to fight this other front war with independents who clearly don't like what they've seen from him, and they like Tallarico. Tallarico's hovering around 40% with independents, which is better than Beto O'Rourke or Colin Allred were at the same point back in their campaigns when we were going into the heat of summer, going into the midterm cycles.
You're deep in the polling and what they call the crosstabs, and I know that gets Che excited because he's a huge campaign nerd, and they love that kind of stuff, you know? Absolutely. It's like candy to them. Jeremy, before I bring Che in, you can see how excited he looks. I mean, we know him. He's excited. Jeremy, before I bring him in, you mentioned that that rough number with independents. Is that something that Paxton, you think, can still change because he's now in a different light? Or, given so much voltage and controversy around his history, is it baked in?
Yeah, it's partly baked in and partly because of President Trump, right? You know, with this war going on and these gas prices starting to creep up again, it's like that was the worst and the last thing that Ken Paxton needed. Like he needed that trend line to keep going so maybe people, wouldn't be upset about that. He's now got to figure out, how do I get, Republicans excited about me? Remember, there's not much else on the ballot here in Texas that's going to be driving the electorate. There, the governor has his race, and he's going to be doing his work. But he's in a different situation than Ken Paxton. Paxton's on his own. He needs to get out there and start, trying to define who he is and try to present a better message. But here the thing is, he has no money. Like you pointed in the fundraising, you got to understand that $70 million that James Tallarico has raised so far is historic from a Texas perspective. That is twice the amount of money that Colin Allred or Beto O'Rourke had at the same point in July going into the election cycle.
The questions surrounding Kash Patel's use of the FBI director title to apparently get special treatment during his lavish travels have reached a point where even Republicans who typically defend him are starting to demand answers. Patel has been under scrutiny by Democrats on the House and Senate Judiciary Committees who have received whistleblower accounts that Patel has been demanding special perks from Bureau employees across the country, like helicopter tours and jet ski excursions. Typical FBI director activities. And now our colleague Ken Dilanian reports that those Democrats have gained a key GOP ally. MS Now has, quote, viewed a letter to Patel from Republican Senate Judiciary Chair Chuck Grassley, demanding that Patel turn over information about his flights on FBI aircraft and about the FBI's purchase of BMW vehicles. Grassley's letter asks Patel, quote, for each trip where you used an FBI aircraft for personal travel, have you reimbursed the FBI as required by law? If yes, please provide the records. Grassley acknowledged that FBI policy requires the director to fly in the FBI jet, even when traveling for personal reasons. But he said Congress deserves an accounting of the director's use of FBI aircraft to conduct an independent and objective review. The senator also, quote, asked the director in the letter to please explain why you decided to purchase BMW vehicles instead of Chevy Suburbans. MS Now reported back in December that Patel broke with long-standing precedent by directing the FBI to purchase BMW cars for his use. Patel's spokesperson at the time said the move saved the government money, but the receipts have yet to be provided. Grassley joins the likes of Congressman Jamie Raskin and Senator Dick Durbin, the top Democrats on the Judiciary Committees, who wrote their own letter to Patel this week, stating that they, quote, appreciate Chairman Grassley raising these concerns. As for Patel's luxury vacations, they write, quote, your jet setting and the lack of justification for these trips are out of control. This is not the conduct of a committed and faithful public servant, especially one entrusted with ensuring the safety of almost 350 million Americans. The FBI has not responded to MS Now's request for comment. Kash Patel facing bipartisan scrutiny for his jet setting around the globe is where we start today with the reporter who broke that story, Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian. Also with us, former Assistant Special Agent in Charge at the FBI and National Security and Intelligence Analyst Michael Feinberg. And joining me at the table, law professor at Hofstra University, the author of the Substack, Who Decides, James Sample is here. Ken, rare to see Republicans questioning the conduct of anyone in this administration. Take us through your reporting.
Yeah, that's right, Alicia. And one update, the FBI did respond after the story was published. I got a detailed email from FBI spokesman Ben Williamson taking issue with the allegations in the letter from the Democrats and answering in a very detailed way the questions that Chuck Grassley was raising, which I found interesting because he provided answers that he didn't provide to us when we first asked about, for example, the BMW SUVs back in December. So about those SUVs, he now says, which he didn't say back then, that they had originally been purchased by the State Department and they were sitting idle in a warehouse, and the FBI, Kash Patel, decided to purchase them, and that the taxpayers actually saved money, $270,000 per vehicle, he claims, as compared to the armored Chevy Suburbans that they usually use to drive the FBI director around. Now, I don't have any documents that validate that claim, but that's what he's saying. And what's interesting is that Chuck Grassley, who's the Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee, is demanding and asking for those documents. And he, unlike the Democrats, he has the leverage to get them. And it seems to be having an effect on how the FBI is responding. So Grassley's concerned about those BMWs. He also is asking a series of questions about Kash Patel's use of the FBI jet, which is essentially an executive jet. It's a private jet, the kind of jets that CEOs fly around the country on. It's a luxurious travel experience. And Kash Patel, the FBI, pointed out that he's required by policy to fly on that jet for security reasons anywhere he goes, even on personal trips. And that's true. But what the Democrats are saying is that he's obviously taking advantage of this rule to essentially attach vacations to these official trips. And we all saw in Milan when he was in the locker room after the men's hockey team won the Olympics. That was allegedly an official trip, but he had a lot of personal time there. And he claims, Kash Patel does, that he's reimbursing the government by policy for the cost of a coach fare for all of these trips, which is what the rules require. But Democrats say it's a matter of he's exploiting this, and they question whether he's actually creating official trips to sort of as an excuse to go on vacation. They're actually saying that he may have opened an office in Wellington, New Zealand, just as an excuse to go to Australia and New Zealand. Now, again, he's denying that. And they're saying that whistleblowers are telling them that when he goes on some of these trips, he's demanding that FBI personnel set up, special excursions for him, including jet skiing and a helicopter tour. Again, he is denying that today through an email to us, but that's what the Democrats are hearing from whistleblowers. And I hear a lot of concerns, I have to say, inside the FBI about just what this looks like, about that they can't imagine a Robert Mueller or a Chris Wray doing this kind of thing. Even though they flew on the jet, they sometimes flew to their vacation homes. They didn't do the kinds of things that Kash Patel is doing.
Michael Feinberg, have you heard those same concerns, and what does it mean for the FBI, even just the appearance of impropriety?
It means that the organization is going to be taken less seriously by the American public. And that's just not a reputational harm. The FBI is only as successful as its ability to talk to people on the street, whether victims of crime, witnesses to horrific events, or even putative subjects themselves, and establish rapport and trust and know that the conversations and interactions are going to be taken with the utmost seriousness. But if every other day there's a story about the FBI director, trying to leverage jet skis out of a business trip, that's going to bounce back poorly on the workforce who is out there actually dealing with the community. And, I just have to add, there's a real irony here in Chuck Grassley getting upset about this, because Kash Patel was not a shoo-in for this position. There was a lot of chatter, as you all know, that he might not make it through confirmation because in most Washington circles, including conservative ones, he was not viewed as a very serious person. But after the preliminary meeting prior to his confirmation hearings, Chuck Grassley effusively endorsed him and said that he was just the person to help reform the FBI and restore its reputation with the American public. Perhaps this effort now to suss out the jet issue is some form of a mea culpa, but we wouldn't be here today were it not for Grassley.
Well, Ken, Senator Grassley said back in April of Patel, I've never had an FBI director cooperate with me as much as Kash Patel has cooperated with me on my request for information, my request for documents. You made the point to me earlier, Ken, and I think it's a good one. This was not a letter that Chuck Grassley intended to make public. He was trying to thread the needle of maintaining his relationship with Patel, perhaps in the interest of actually extracting the information that has apparently now been shared with you. If they are sharing this with you, do you think it is one step closer to their sharing the same information, perhaps with the receipts we also desperately want to see with Senator Grassley?
Well, to be clear, Alicia, Chuck Grassley's office did not share this letter with me. I'm not sure they intended this letter to be made public. In fact, they took steps to keep it secret, which is interesting because normally these kinds of requests are made public. And Grassley's a really interesting figure because he does, for years, he's been around forever, right? And for years, he had a habit of and a reputation of conducting bipartisan, vigorous oversight and being a steward of the taxpayer dollar. But in recent years, he's become so partisan and such a defender slander of Donald Trump and Kash Patel and everything the Justice Department and the FBI has done, that it was surprising to see that he's actually asking critical questions here. But he points out in the letter that he has a bipartisan history of doing this, and he feels like it's part of the role of Congress to oversee this kind of spending. And so he's doing it. Whether he'll actually follow through and demand these documents and then make them public after, or have a hearing or that kind of oversight, remains to be seen, I think. But this is the first step.
If there were actually, James Sample, proper oversight, which, as you've made the point to me, only possible if there is bipartisan interest in that oversight, especially at a time when you have Republicans in control of the Senate, is there then legal liability for Kash Patel if he is found to have misused government assets?
Potentially minimal legal liability. So, for example, the cost of coach airfare, which is what you're required to reimburse when you use the jet for personal purposes. But politically, the optics here matter more than the law. The politics matter more than the law. And there's a template, right? In Trump 1.0, Tom Price and Ryan Zinke lost jobs for essentially turning public service into private profiteering and sort of junket category. And so I think here the tell is not the use of the jet. The tell is not the BMWs, although that is remarkable reporting. I'm convinced there are about 6 Kendallanians, not one. The tell here is that the letterhead comes from Chuck Grassley, and that makes it meaningful.
Michael Feinberg, in the letter that Congressman Raskin and Senator Durbin write of Patel, they write, quote, demoted personnel in Brussels because they failed to ensure you were adequately entertained, stoking fear among rank-and-file agents that they must provide your demanded perks or face termination. Concerns and strains prompted by the prioritization of your personal entertainment on international trips may have led to the resignation of the head of the FBI's international operations this year. There is, of course, Michael Feinberg, just on its face what this all means. There's also the extent to which his requests, the use of resources, begins to muddle the focus and where resources inside the FBI should actually be going.
I would push back on the notion that there is any focus at FBI headquarters right now, aside from carrying water for whatever Donald Trump and Stephen Miller's policy priorities of the day are. When I was in the FBI for over a decade and a half, there was actually a really rigorous process for most of that time where we prioritized what threats were most salient, where we needed the most intelligence analysis, where our shortfalls were in terms of facilities and physical stock, how we were going to get things as quotidian as ammunition for both training and duty carrying. I hear nothing from my friends who are still there, except how all those processes have fallen apart and how where previous directors, they obviously felt some sort of affinity for the president who appointed them. They maintained a brick wall of propriety between how they conducted themselves officially and whatever those personal feelings were. The fact that Chuck Grassley and Kash Patel have this direct line of communication that you quoted earlier has not redounded to the benefit of the workforce. In fact, that pipeline of communication has been used almost exclusively to tar the names of FBI agents who investigated Trump and then fire them. So I'm just not buying that anybody in this entire situation is really behaving as an honest broker.
Mr. President, have you spoken to Senator Mitch McConnell since his hospitalization? How's he doing? Do you have any idea how he's doing?
I have no idea how he's doing.
Well, MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell has been on top of this story. Charlie is still with us. Michael, this is now bipartisan. Does that change things?
It could, Alicia. It could certainly put some pressure on his office to release more information or just simply say what brought him into the hospital and why he is still there right now. But up until this point, we have not gotten that kind of information. Where things stand right now are not very different from when I spoke to you yesterday. And it's because we still have not gotten any updates from Senator McConnell's office. What we do know is that Senate Majority Leader John Thune and the second highest ranking Senate Republican John Barrasso, they both said that they spoke with McConnell earlier this week. They had about 20-minute phone calls each. They spoke about a number of topics, but still no update on his condition. Yesterday, there was that letter from Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky asking McConnell's office for more information. And now, as you mentioned, we are hearing from some Republicans who say they really don't know what's going on with him, and there is some concern. You just spoke about Marlin Stutzman. I also want to show you some comments from Brett Guthrie. He is a Republican who represents part of Kentucky in the House of Representatives. He said he's texted with McConnell, but there's still some question about what that actually means. Take a listen.
This isn't a voice communication, and you haven't seen him.
Well, I haven't talked to him personally.
So how do you know that the texts themselves are actually coming from the man?
Well, I don't. I've never known anybody to text for him when we text back and forth. So I just absolutely assumed that was from him. So I'm going to be fine. That's what I got back, the response. And I've talked to people on his staff, and I haven't directly talked to him, but I understood he talked to John Thune yesterday or the day before, my understanding, Barrasso and some others. I do believe he's going to recover, and I hope he's back in Washington soon. We need him back.
Now, Alicia, the fact that we are discussing and debating whether or not a text from somebody's phone number is actually a text from them, I think speaks volumes about the place we're in right now when it comes to Senator McConnell's condition. One more thing I'll leave you with. We've gotten the first indication of some questions, or some pressure, rather, for Senator McConnell to potentially step aside and resign. There's a new tweet out from Congresswoman Nancy Mace, the Republican from South Carolina. She writes on X, quote, "If McConnell is in as bad a shape as Biden ever was, or worse, he needs to step aside. This charade can't continue. We can't demand of others what we won't demand of ourselves." So we are, Alicia, coming up on that 1 month mark since Mitch McConnell was brought to the hospital. Again, still no word on his condition and what brought him there in the first place, but certainly the bipartisan pressure for more information, very much so, rising right now.
Charlie, is it telling that the president didn't make it onto Mitch McConnell's call list?
Well, yes, obviously, Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump have not been on speaking terms, I think, for some time. But, I hate having to agree with Nancy Mace here. But if we're going to have a gerontocracy, I think the minimal standard should be a little bit of transparency. If we're going to have people who are in their 80s, who are in, either in the presidency, in the Senate, or on the U.S. Supreme Court, I think the minimal thing that we could expect, the obligation, is to tell us whether they are still alive, what their condition is, whether they are ever going to come back and be able to do their duties. We've just seen so many of these, and quite frankly, cover-ups of the condition. And this notion that somehow someone got a text from Mitch McConnell's number so that we should take that seriously. No, I think that right now, given everything that we have gone through over the last few years, that the voters have every right to say, no, we want some proof of life. We want some actual information. And I think that that is a moral and political obligation of the offices, including of the office of the president, of Supreme Court justices, senators, and members of Congress, who, by the way, we've had a number of them just simply vanish from the face of the earth, and nobody knows where they are. Look, as long as they're working for the taxpayers and allegedly representing, the American public, we have the right to know, and I think the obligation to know, whether they are still compos mentis or around.
Well, Mike, I've got about 30 seconds left. I think that Charlie's point is especially true because this is about to affect the legislative process.
Yeah, that's right. Senator McConnell notably sits on the Senate Appropriations Committee, which is going to be very key as we get closer to that September 30th government funding deadline. There is a potential shutdown that could transpire. It's a conversation we have every single year up on Capitol Hill. If the Senate Appropriations Committee tries to advance any of those spending bills, and they do fall along party lines, if McConnell isn't there to vote, it means that the committee would be deadlocked. And on Capitol Hill, a tie fails, which means that we are coming up to a point where McConnell's absence could be a real problem for Republicans, for the legislative process, for the funding of the government overall. So right now, it's sort of a question of, well, when will he come back? What's his condition? But we are getting closer to a point, Alicia, where it could be, well, actually, what can we do or not do if he's not here to actually cast a vote?